Okay, so today I would like to talk about the second jhana and weave into that, as usual, some things that apply much more generally to maybe any jhana or jhana practice in general. So as I said at the beginning, the teachings will progress, if you like, through the retreat at the pace that they do, dependent on a lot of factors, partly my medical appointments and things like that. And it's highly unlikely that, in fact, it's totally undesirable if your practice progresses at the same rate. So at some point you're going to coincide, and you may have already done that, or maybe later, but what we're really interested in is your pace. That's really, really important. What's your playground? What's your pace? When is it a maturing or transition time, etc. So, let me read again, as I read very rushed through when I first read them, the Buddha's description of the second jhana, of which again there's two. There's a simile and there's a sort of more technical sounding one. Okay, so again, a practitioner with the subsiding of, listen to these interesting translations, with the subsiding of thinking and pondering. Again, there's that vitakka vichara, how different this translation from the usual, or more common these days, initial and sustained application. That's really the vitakka vicharanam vipassana in Pali. So it's like, this is a fine translation, with the subsiding of thinking and pondering, by gaining inner tranquility and unity of mind, reaches and remains in the second jhana, which is free from thinking and pondering, born of concentration, and filled with delight and happiness. So again, filled with piti and sukha, actually. So this person's translating piti as delight. Actually, I think they've even done it the other way around. It doesn't matter. It's with the subsiding of vitakka vichara, by gaining inner tranquility and unity of mind, reaches and remains in the second jhana, which is characterized by its free from thinking and pondering, free from vitakka and vichara, born of concentration and filled with piti and sukha. I will read another translation, just so you get a sense of. So he's described the practitioner going through the first jhana, and then said, furthermore, or more than that, with the stilling of directed thought and evaluation. Again, so here's quite a different translation of vitakka and vichara. With the stilling of vitakka and vichara, of directed thought and evaluation, however we're going to translate vitakka and vichara, she enters and remains in the second jhana. Rapture and pleasure, piti and sukha. So again, let's just go with these words, piti and sukha. I'm going to translate sukha as happiness, and I'll come back to that. Piti and sukha, born of composure. That's interesting. The actual Pali word is samadhi, so which the first person has translated as concentration, and this person has translated as composure. As I said, I would translate samadhi as quite a broad term. It's a unification, it's harmonization, it's the agreement of the elements of being, right? But different. Born of samadhi, a unification of awareness, free from directed thought and evaluation, free of vitakka and vichara, internal assurance. She permeates and pervades, suffuses and fills this very body with the rapture, with the piti and sukha born of composure, born of samadhi. There is nothing of her entire body unpervaded by piti and sukha born of samadhi. So there's a few other elements in here that we need to... So basically, the vitaka and vichara fade, and born of the samadhi is piti and sukha, which is then spread. That's all we've got as a description. A couple of other things, that it's born of samadhi. So it's born of samadhi is distinguishing it from the first jhana, where the Buddha said is born from withdrawal from the hindrances, or seclusion from the hindrances. So this is born of samadhi. And remember how rich that term samadhi is, how wide, for me at least, hopefully for you. What's this unification of awareness? The Pali is cetaso ekodibhavam. The chitta, unified or raised to oneness. It's unified. And then this word at the end we'll come back to later. Ajjatam sampasadanam. Internal assurance this person has. Sometimes you hear the word confidence, internal confidence. So we'll come back to that actually later. So experience, that's what we have from the suttas. And then we have we have a gorgeous simile. I find it gorgeous. Just as a lake fed by a spring with no inflow from east, west, north or south, where the rain god sends moderate showers from time to time, the water welling up from below, mingling with cool water, would suffuse, fill and irradiate that cool water, so that no part of the pool was untouched by it. So with this piti and sukha born of samadhi, the practitioner so suffuses their body that no spot remains untouched. So remember, we're talking about a very hot climate where that kind of image is going to be super, super appealing, unlike Devon in December. So to me that's a lovely, lovely image, and I feel very much as you get it more into the jhanas, some of these similes that they actually seem more accurate than the more technical sounding descriptions, which are open to all kinds of sort of ambiguities over translations and terms and what they might have meant at one historical period and then another. So just to me, there's something much more accurate about the poetic translation than there is about the what sounds more technical and the kind of descriptions and languages, and there are these 5 factors and there are these 3 factors, and we tend to think, oh, that must be the really accurate one. But you'll see how you do with it. See what you gravitate towards, what opens, what you learn as time goes on. So this is the descriptions we have. They're pretty brief. Again, as I think I mentioned, was it yesterday that or another time, when a new territory, when the mind opens into a new realm, a new territory, a new level, it tends to experience that level as effortless at first. It's just, whoa, we're suddenly not in Kansas anymore, we're suddenly, what is this? And you're just going along with the ride, it feels like, and it's effortless and wonderful. There's always exceptions, but it tends to be that that's the case. Then, at times after that, after those first few experiences where it's all just effortlessly kind of happening and you're almost just a bewitched witness of the whole experience, then it might be that at times the relationship with the second jhana matures. And so that at times we're actually practicing, we're conscious of, it's not effortless anymore, I need to actually practice tuning to this frequency of happiness, which at times may be super obvious and kind of blow your socks off, remarkable, like wow, and other times much more subtle and maybe not so remarkable. I need to practice tuning to that and steadying my attention on what is essentially a more refined object. The sukha is more refined than the piti. So, as I mentioned, the jhanas are not primarily a spectrum of stronger and stronger concentration. The 8th jhana is invariably a state of more immovability of mind than the 4th jhana or the 7th jhana, or whatever. That's not necessarily the case. That's not the primary thing that's changing. It might happen that time, but it might just happen completely otherwise at different times. But rather, the jhanas are primarily a spectrum of increasing refinement, let's say, increasing refinement. I'm aware there's a bit of ambiguity between the words subtlety and refinement. So let's choose the word refinement for the way that this cloth is a lot more coarse and less refined than this cloth. Yeah, so the texture of it is much more refined. They're primarily a spectrum of deeper and of more and more refinement. They get more and more refined. Technically, and we'll come back to this, there's a reason for that. It's because they're also a spectrum of less and less fabrication. On the spectrum of the fabrication of perception, if you've never heard that term before, I'll explain it in more detail later on. This is really, really central, and it's really, really important to understand that in general, I would say, in terms of understanding what the Dharma is, where we're going, what emptiness means, what dependent arising means, what liberation means. It's a key concept. The jhanas too map onto that very key central concept, because the jhanas too, in their spectrum of more and more refinement, are also, you could say, places or areas on a spectrum of less and less fabrication. And actually, it's like this coarse cloth has almost like more material to it. It's thicker and denser, and this fine cloth has got less material to it. It's thinner and more. There's more filaments, So we're actually fabricating less as we go deeper and deeper into jhanas. We may or may not be aware of that, but to become conscious of it and to understand it and understand its implications is huge, is massive. And in a way, I would say we don't really understand what the jhanas are, really understand how they relate to insight practice or how they integrate into the whole practice. And we don't really understand what we're doing when we're practicing concentration. We don't really understand that until we understand this. And its relation to the whole notion of the fabrication of perception. One fabricates more or less at different times. How does that happen, and what happens when we fabricate more or less? We will come back to that. However, having said all that, in the second jhana we've just got born of samadhi. So there is, I think it's true to say that usually a state of second jhana is an improvement of concentration on the first jhana, usually. But that samadhi, again, it's a wider word: unification, harmonization, etc. A wider word than it usually gets translated as just concentration, I would say. So, it may be that a practitioner is still at this point staying with their breath. The breath is the primary object, and the piti has come up, and they're really mixing that with the breath and getting into that, and then the happiness comes up. And one can, if one wants, stay with the breath. Or the metta might be the base practice, and one can, if one wants, stay with the metta. But what happens is, or what should happen, is they get mixed. It must feel at some point that I'm breathing happiness, or the breath has become happiness, or the metta has become happiness. I am radiating out sukha and happiness, or the body has become happiness. The Buddha says, no part of the body left unpervaded by this sukha and piti. Now, so you have the option of what I meant by saying what I just said, you have the option of keeping with the breath if that's your base practice and you want to, and that's what helps, or keeping with the metta. But it should integrate those primary, those base practice, the sense of the base practice objects, the metta or the breath, should completely integrate with the happiness. Like I said, they just become happiness. Or you can, like described with the first jhana, you can make the happiness the primary object and what you're primarily paying attention to. And then the breath or the metta may support that a little bit, or it's just gone. You're really not concerned with it. And you have a bodily, we'll come back to this, a body sense of happiness, an emotional sense of happiness, and that's what you're concentrating on. If, I think I threw this out already, if we were just all to take a sort of school trip to Newton Abbot, and each one of us were to stop someone on the street and say, think of something that makes you happy, and then can you concentrate on that happiness? I think most people would just be baffled, and it would feel impossible or very, very difficult. So for most of us, it's actually happiness as an object to focus on and to steady the mind to and to tune to is actually something we never do, and we wouldn't know how to do, and we wouldn't be able to do. So we're training that. We have to train that. We're not, as I said, concentrating so much on a spatial point. We're concentrating, if you like, on that frequency or that bandwidth of frequencies, which is happiness. Yeah, that's really what we're doing. Within that, or within our intention to do that and our playing with that, there may be times when the attention is really steady and really focusing on a spatial point. But that spatial point is happiness, or it's the center of the happiness. So again, what we're really doing is focusing on the happiness, and that's central, rather than thinking of concentration as a focus on a spatial point. It may be at times that that's what's helpful, and at other times that's not what's helpful. We let go of the sense of the spatial point being so important. And it's the frequency. Okay, so this word sukha, S-U-K-K-H-A in Pali, it's an emotional quality, the emotion of happiness. And again, I mean that word in quite a broad way. So it's technically in Buddhist psychology, it's a chitta quality. It's a quality of the heart and mind. However, it's also physical, and this we really want to emphasize. You feel it as much in the body, and you need to feel it in the body. This is why partly the person in Newton Abbot, or wherever we're going, won't be able to do it, because it's just an extremely ephemeral, extremely wispy mental quality. They can't locate it in their body, so feeling it in the body, pervading the body with it, is exactly partly what enables us to really get into it and really stabilize with it. So when I say in the body, I mean in the energy body, in the whole space, in the vibration tone. It becomes happiness. The vibration tone of the energy body space becomes happiness. So at the beginning, at first, when you open to this level, either the second jhana or just the emergence of the sukha, identifying it as an emotion is, for most people, actually quite a crucial distinction to make. The piti is a primarily physical quality. The emotion is, the sukha is an emotion. And just making that distinction, although, because of what I just said, it's actually not quite true. They're both energy body vibrations. They're different energy body vibrations. But it will really help you make the distinction, get a sense of the different playgrounds, get a sense of the territory, and actually build the whole thing if you recognize it and feel it as an emotional quality as well. That's what's going to really start to distinguish it from the piti. So that identifying it as an emotional quality versus a primarily physical quality, which the piti, we could regard the piti as, and the piti isn't just that either. So again, it's not this black and white, but sometimes making things black and white is actually really helpful at a certain stage to make things clearer. Is it the ultimate truth? Definitely not. But it just making that division at first is really helpful. It will help to draw it out of the mix, to draw out that emotional quality of sukha from the mix. This is the emotion. That's what I'm paying attention to at first. And to begin to distinguish, this is piti, this is sukha. And you really need to taste it, which really means feel it in the body, and feel the different qualities and enjoy them quite a few times, perhaps, to really get used to this. At first it might be very, very obvious. If the second jhana just explodes out of the first, it's very obvious. I'm in a completely different territory now. But again, as time goes on, there might be like, hold on a minute, where's the division here? So this distinguishing, this making discernments is actually really, as again, what we're talking about when I emphasize sensitivity, attunement, discernment. It's all really key. Not just to jhana practice, what we said right at the beginning, to the quality of your relationship with your own emotions and your wisdom with your own emotions, your sensitivity to all kinds of things in life, your capacity in relationship, the skill you can work with in emptiness practice, in soul-making practice, in Brahma-vihara practice. That's why we emphasized it. I would say that, or rather a lot of people say, and I agree with them, that, as the Buddha says, piti and sukha are both present in the first jhana, and they're both present in the second jhana. But what's characteristic of the first jhana is that the piti is to the fore. We're kind of entranced by that more, and maybe there's more of it in the mix. And then in the second jhana, that flips, and the sukha becomes prominent over the piti. The piti is still there, but the sukha becomes prominent. And the sukha is our primary nimitta, whereas in the first jhana, the piti was the primary nimitta. So Karen asked me, that's not in the Pali Canon? No, I've never seen it in the Pali Canon. I mean, it might be somewhere. I very much doubt it, but I don't think so. Maybe it's in a commentary somewhere. I'm not sure. So when I say that, I'm speaking from the teachers that I have really trusted and who have taught me jhana practice, or from whom I've learnt jhana practice, and from my own experience. And it's just that's pretty clear. Is it in the Pali Canon? Don't think so. We get these very brief descriptions. As we go into the further jhanas, the descriptions are even briefer. So we have to somehow discern and get a sense of what the territory is. But as I said, I think I've already said it twice, and I'll say it once more. Back to this distinguishing between piti and sukha, really making that distinction. What can happen if we don't is this kind of stagnation. It's the discernment that takes us deeper. It's the sensitivity to tune that takes us deeper on the whole path, deeper on the jhana path, in a full way. And again, I know people, I know practitioners sit a lot, etc., did sit a lot, put a lot of work in, and they reach a kind of place that's sort of around this area, and it's a kind of a mix, and they do not, either they do not take the instruction or they do not bother to make the differentiation. And it's 20 years later, and they're still pretty much hovering around in the same kind of soup. That might be completely fine with them, or they might want something different, but they're not going to open up anywhere deeper unless they make the distinctions, the discriminations, the subtle discriminations. It's nice where they are, and they can sit for quite a while, etc., but it hasn't gone anywhere, and not much even new insight. So it doesn't just apply to the depth of samadhi practice, it applies to the insight practice as well. That all got stagnated as well. Just because I don't know why they didn't want to make the discernment. Maybe it was, I don't know. Why do people... It's a whole other question. Sometimes, though, they're mixed. The piti and the sukha are mixed, and it's hard to tell at the beginning. So there will be, if you're new to the second jhana, there will be times when I'm not quite sure. But generally speaking, we want to be clear. This is piti and this is sukha. And generally speaking, they do kind of separate like that. But there will be times when it's actually quite hard to tell. What all that means is that part of the work and or play, depending on your favorite word there. Part of the work and play at this stage is exactly that. That's part of your job. Can I really get used to what the differences are? Can I make the discriminations? Yeah, that's really part of the work. So how does the second jhana arise? Well, what color is an unripe mango? Is it green? What color is a ripe mango? Is it kind of yellow, red? Yeah? Okay, but let's say it's more yellow, red. Yeah? Is that okay? So one of my Ajahn Jeff used to say, don't take a green, unripe mango and paint it yellow, red, and then call that a ripe mango. Don't take your practice wherever it is and try and do some stuff and call that the second jhana. Don't take your first jhana and push it or put pressure on it or just do something that you're kind of forcing a mango to ripen. So his approach was very much on like these things will ripen in their own time. And if you do it that way, rather than kind of jumping the gun or forcing anything or wanting to achieve something or having some kind of timetable, it will be much, much more fruitful. Again, generally speaking, there's all kinds of exceptions, and I'll come back to some of those exceptions. So again, we talked about, remember when we talked about piti, we said generally speaking, you could say there's two ways that piti arises. One is, I take an object, maybe it's a point in the abdomen or the breath or the nostrils. If it's the breath, maybe I take the metta, whatever it is, and I just work with that. I do not put up with the hindrances when they come. I really try and work with the hindrances, and I have this background awareness, and I play with this idea of more intense attention, less intense attention, delicacy of attention, subtilizing the attention. If I do all that, those, 4 things, then the way the piti tends to arise is sudden and eruptive and quite strong after, for most people, quite a while. So that's good. And then there's another way, which is taking the energy body experience from the beginning and actually just kind of tending to the little ember of well-being there, fanning it when it needs fanning, protecting it when it needs protection from the winds, etc., building in a way, coaxing it to become more of a campfire, the piti. But that needs work and play. Playing with the modes of attention, playing with kind of very intense probing at times, or intense attention, intense opening, radical opening, receiving, etc. So I have to be intense. You know, I can't at times at least. I have to be intense with how I'm coaxing this ember. Sometimes my, let's say, my intention and my attention and my whole work and play has to be quite intense without putting pressure or a demand on it. So that's also part of the whole deal. When we get to the second jhana and this happiness, it might be the case, as I said, that it probably relies more on its arising in a way that's helpful. It probably relies more on a really very gratifying relationship with the piti. The piti, one is really into it and really enjoying it. So if you're sort of, the piti's okay and it's kind of, it's okay, and then a bit like maybe the second jhana would be better. That goes back to the foolish, inexperienced cow. Remember that? So I have to what does this mean here? It means then that, again, with the piti that's arisen, I have to work and play with that in these ways. I actually have to shape it. I need to really take care of it and take care of my relationship to it. The sukha of the second jhana will only arise when I do that. Okay. So if it matures, if the sukha of the second jhana matures organically, like this mango, it emerges through working and playing with the piti, then it and through the piti feeling really lovely, really pleasurable, really enjoyable, then the sukha emerges in a much clearer way. It's like, whoa, this really is something else now. Now this is really something quite extraordinary. And this is clearly what that word sukha means. It's clearly the second jhana, whatever, depending on where you end up. After that, to say in different words what I said earlier, after a few times of that, then you might find yourself needing to, in other words, after quite a bit of experience with the second jhana, then you might find yourself needing to go back, and you can work with a much more subtle and unremarkable sukha and build it up, the way we built up the ember of well-being into piti. So does this make sense what I'm saying? It's like if I've got a piti that's not that great, then my chances of taking a happiness that's it's okay, and building it into the second jhana are probably, there's always exceptions, and I'd be really interested if there are actually to hear back, just for teaching purposes. But it's more likely that the happiness that comes when the piti wasn't that remarkable, and then the sukha is not that remarkable, it will be hard to get that to feel really gratifying and like this is really something. Versus the piti that can arise with patience and time from just working with the ember in the energy body can be. Does this make sense, the distinction? Not quite. Okay. With the piti, we can go two ways. I take an object, I stick with it, but I have to be careful how I'm sticking with it and be intense and watch it be subtle with the attention and the delicacy and all that. I can do that, or I can just take the ember of well-being in the energy body and build it and build it and build it. So basically, I can get either of two ways to a piti that's really nice. When you come to the second jhana, I'm just wondering whether the probability of coming to a sukha, which is characteristic of the second jhana, that's really nice, it's not an equal probability. I can't start from a happiness that's not really that gratifying, especially if that was built on a piti that never got really that gratifying. It's probably possible, but at first it's unlikely. At the piti, I have to get really into the piti. I have to really get that far and really enjoy it, and then it's more likely to succeed. After a lot of experience with the sukha and the second jhana, then you can take a really quite unremarkable happiness, and you're already quite skilled, and it's already quite familiar, and that can grow. Yeah? So, okay. Yeah, I'm sure I could have said that more elegantly. Good. Okay, so having said all that, sometimes what I encounter in teaching is someone whose first jhana is just great and they're even getting all the elements of mastery. So it's usually the case that as a person really starts to, gain those elements of mastery through practice with the first jhana, that the second jhana is already kind of intruding, emerging, showing itself. That's usually the case. Occasionally, or sometimes, I don't know what proportion of times, someone's first jhana, they're really enjoying it, they're really into it, and there is some of those elements of mastery, but the second jhana is not showing. It's not emerging, etc. So sometimes this is not how Ajahn Jeff would teach, is that you never paint that mango at all, or you never force a ripening. I would say sometimes there's some things that you could do, little tricks you can play with. So one is, here's the piti, I'm really used to it, I'm really into it, it's going great. Right now, it's going great. Okay, generally I'm into it, I've practiced with it, etc. I've gotten used to all that, all the mastery, or a lot of the mastery. And then, right now, it's going great in this sitting, walking, standing, whatever it is. And then, when it's going great, I can just drop a question, like just a really light question. What is the emotion right now? What's the emotion I'm feeling right now? And the answer should be happiness. It should be sukha. So that's one possibility. A second possibility, again, here it is, going quite well. Again, this is something that it doesn't need to be going well. That after a while, after a lot of practice, it doesn't need to be going well for this one to work. But here, let's say at the beginning, when it's not quite happening, here I am, and I drop in the word, whichever word I prefer, a whisper, a grain of magic, alchemical, chemical. Just drop it in, a drop into the chitta, happiness, or joy, or sukha, or whatever word is that you prefer. As I said, the mind goes deeper in samadhi, just becomes more and more suggestive, and potently so. More and more sensitive the mind becomes, sensitive to suggestion, sensitive, becomes more malleable in all kinds of ways. So that would be a second. Another funny thing you can try is, you've probably noticed that most often piti tends to flow upwards in the body. One feels a sort of upward current of it. And what you can try sometimes is just feel that upward current. Again, this is when you're really used to it and it's great and you're enjoying it. But and then the upward current, imagine it shooting out the top of your head like a fountain, like a spout of a fountain. The water comes out the top of your head, and then like a fountain, it falls back down. Just imagine that. See what happens. A fourth possibility, I'm not sure how much one might want to try this or how we'll see, but it may well be very useful for some people at some times. Again, here's the piti, it's going well, I'm into my practice right now, and just the memory, introduce, again, very, very subtle, just the memory of something that makes you happy or a happiness. Just like a little tincture, a little drop of tincture into the chitta, the memory of a happiness while the piti is there. Drop that in. So these are all little tricks. As I said, in a way, the safest gamble is to let something mature and just get really, really into the piti. Find that enjoyment, find that intensity of relationship with the piti, whether that's so don't confuse intensity with this kind of forward probing narrowing. That's one form of intensity. Another form is how intensely am I opening? But an intensely enjoyable relationship with the piti. And it matures out of that in time. If not, or if you feel like, well, I'm kind of, or if the teacher says, well, I'm kind of, maybe you want to try one of those tricks. If you're playing enough, you will discover your own tricks at this point, at this threshold, at this border between the first and second jhana. You should discover your own tricks and come and share them with us. There's all kinds of things are possible. Eventually, you won't need any tricks because you're going to be, hopefully, you'll have mastery of the second jhana, which means you just have the subtle intention for the second jhana or for the sukha to arise, and it goes there. And all the tricks, it's like I can't even remember the tricks I've learned, I used to play with. This was all I could come up with because I couldn't remember. So after a while, one just doesn't need them. It's just from intention. But there is that point of learning new territory where you will be like, well, it's gone there before. Now, how do I get it back? Or if it needs a nudging, yeah. Okay, so going back to something I mentioned earlier, there's this phrase there in Pali. It's vitaka vicharanam vipassana, which means something like with the subsiding, with the allaying, with the cessation, with the calming of vitaka and vichara. What? Thinking about initial and sustained application. That begins to not make much sense at this point. So what is that? He refers to that as part that's characteristic here. Vichara, that word also has a particular meaning sometimes. So it's used as a pair. Vitaka vichara just means thinking. Vichara has a particular meaning of kind of discursive thought. Thinking, it's like, what I mean by that is the mind getting hooked on a thought and following a thought. And so for more than one moment. So this thought leads to that thought, or I'm following a train of thought. This is discursive thinking. So discursive in English comes from the Latin currere, which means to run, to move fastly. The mind is in a certain, you understand, it's hooked and it's moved Does that make sense? The mind is moved with a thought. One thought follows another. So when we reason, this, therefore that, therefore the next thing, that's also, in English, that's also discursive thought. That's also one of the meanings of discursive thought, is sort of consequential movement of thought. I would say that if you're careful enough in your attention, and if you're sensitive enough in your attention, you will notice in the second jhana that it may be that thought arises at times. This chitta which has infinite depth and subtlety, it may be that thought arises at times, but what there isn't in the second jhana is any being hooked to a thought. The mind is not then moved off on a thought. One thought does not lead to a second thought. This follows that, or I was thinking this, and then... And the kind of thought that arises is probably very, very wispy, very, very subtle. It's not extended in time either. So there's a larger point here, I think, just about, in addition to mapping out what actually is the range of experience of the second jhana, and there's a larger, perhaps even equally important point. What is it to have a thought? We use that word so much. I'm thinking, or there was thought, or there wasn't thought. I would say the whole idea of thought and the whole experience of thought has an enormous range to it. To the mind shouting something and completely lost in a tangle of shouting at itself or whatever it is, and very coarse thoughts, to extremely, extremely subtle, the kind of subtlety that most people wouldn't even notice, and we're not used to, we're not even aware that, there might be this level there. So an invitation alongside all this to open up that investigation, to pay attention and notice, what do we mean when we say thought, and what does it mean when the mind gets quiet? Is it completely quiet? Is it quiet at a certain level? What kind of thoughts have gone? What kind of relationship with thought has gone? So we're not... what has gone is the being hooked onto a thought, or for more than, for being hooked onto a thought, and one thought hooking us to the next, one thought being hooked to the next. That's gone, and also gross thought has gone. So again, this is the sort of thing, it may take a while to notice this. And I really mean, again, this is also, again, why I keep, and sorry to anyone who doesn't like this, but why subtlety and sensitivity is such an important part for me in the teaching. One begins to realize, these things are not so black and white, and there's way more subtlety of range for most phenomena than we tend to realize at first. And we can develop our sensitivity and get aware of that range of subtlety, and that pays enormous dividends. So all this business about what is thought actually has huge implications for very, very deep insight. People talk about non-conceptual awareness, and the mind was completely non-conceptual, etc. And so what's the difference between a conception and a thought? And does a conception have to be verbal? Does a thought have to be verbal? I need to notice all this for the really deep end of insight, when you're talking about really deep unfabricating. or understandings of emptiness and the way certain words are used in text and stuff like that, but we won't talk about that now. So like I said, it may take a while to notice this. In a way, what happens with the samadhi of the second jhana is partly what enables us, or should enable us to do, is to begin to notice this a little bit. But as I said, whenever it was, usually at first, a new level, when the mind enters a new level, it's like a dam bursting, and the water is just gushing, and you're just going along for this water ride, and it just seems like there's no thought happening. In time, it's like your eyes getting used to a darkened room. You start, hold on a minute. There's some things here I didn't notice at first. But we're talking about something very, very subtle, and it's a whole different relationship, whole different level of thought. So you don't need to go, let's leave that. But this encouragement, I said, how wise would it be to use my perception of the presence or absence of thought as a kind of measurement of where I am in samadhi. And I keep kind of glancing there. Is it stop thinking yet? I don't think that would be very helpful or very wise at all. And given the confusion of what vitakka and vichara means, and B, the subtlety of the range of what thinking might be, I can't see that much value in it. You will notice something in relation to thought if you're really getting into this. So don't make that the primary criterion. So I would like to say, as I said before, each jhana has a primary nimitta, right? And the second jhana, the primary nimitta is sukha. That's the thing that we're really making primary and really getting into, and we're really taking care of, and we're really opening our relationship with, etc., and getting into. So there's what's significant in practice, but there's why is that the significant? Why are we making that the significant thing in practice? There may be, I would be very surprised if there aren't, people out there with the idea that the most significant thing about the second jhana is the quieting, the stilling of thought. I don't know, maybe there are. So again, we have to think, why do I choose this to make this an emphasis over that? Of all the things I could emphasize in practice right now, of all the things I could make a priority, why this and not that? Or why that and not this? Remember we were talking about this, that how I think about samadhi and how I relate to samadhi in the present moment is related to my big view. Yes? You guys okay today? Yeah? Whether you're okay? Or yes. Yes, okay, good. Thank you. So we apply that here. Here's this bag of little factors. Which is the most significant one? And why? So I'm going to choose the sukha as the most significant one. Maybe there's someone who chooses the less thought as the most significant one. So I would say the quietening of thought is not the most significant or transformative aspect or factor. It's actually an absence of a factor here, isn't it? It's the absence of two factors that were present in the first jhana. I would say that's not the most transformative factor or aspect of the second jhana. I would say happiness is. And it's the happiness, it's the sukha, it's the range of happiness, it's the remarkability of that happiness, it's the fact that it comes pretty much independent of someone needing to praise me or some sense pleasure or something. These are the things that transform. If and only if I really marinate in it and I really drink it lots and lots of times for a long time, then that happiness is really, really going to make a difference in one's life. Huge difference. As a resource, we've talked about this before, tremendous resource. Some have asked me, just imagine, several hours a day just drinking that kind of happiness, that depth of happiness, that beauty of happiness. Even half an hour a day, whatever it is, or just after a while just knowing it's there and that you can access it if you want it. The sense of what's possible, this is also really transformed by the tasting of that happiness. One's ability to let go. So that's part of the function of a resource in Dharma. This lovely, lovely feeling means it doesn't so much matter how much money I have or this or that, if I get famous, if I get rich, if the food is nice where I'm staying or not nice or pleasant, or it's completely relativized by that kind of experience. So one's ability to let go is made much more vast, much more steady, much more profound, much more wide-reaching because of the happiness. And it's a happiness, as I said, that's pretty much independent of what someone is giving me or sense pleasures, etc. I don't know. It's massive. The difference only if we marinate for a long period of time with the happiness is what I'm drinking. I'm drinking that. Slaking the thirst for what we're really looking for, chasing the sense pleasures or the praise or whatever it is. I'm going to leave soul-making Dharma and sensing the soul completely out of this conversation for now, because some of you know that gets a lot more interesting and there's a lot more to say there, but I'm just leaving it out for now, not to complicate things. If, though, I decide to say or to take, oh no, it's the quietening of thought, that's the most significant thing about the second jhana. My question would be why? Why do you think that's, and how can you explain how that fits into and makes more sense in a bigger picture? Is it that you believe that when the mind is free of thought, it's seeing things as they really are, or revealing its thought that is the problem, and the thought creates this kind of smokescreen in front of reality, or what is, or whatever language? Do you understand? So when I bring in text, like, how does it fit? What actually is most significant? And why, if I'm choosing to emphasize this, or if a person's choosing to emphasize that, why is that significant? And how is that significant, A, for jhana practice, B, for what it's going to deliver, and C, in the whole path? Okay. Sometimes what happens in practice is that and again, I don't know the figures of how common this is, but I've certainly encountered it quite a few times. So a person is in the first jhana, great, and then they just completely leapfrog the second jhana and end up in the third jhana. That's the next thing that just emerges by itself. So that's quite an interesting thing. Again, maybe we have to think back to where are we trying to go, and in this way of setting up, where we want eventually to have mastery of the second jhana too. Then it would be a question of, okay, do we need to stop now and go back, or should we let the third mature and really get into that and then go back? But it's possible. But it may also skip to, we had this with, for example, Joel's question. Well, it wasn't exactly that question, but the possibility of it skipping or moving from the first jhana to a peacefulness that is not really akin to the third jhana. It's peaceful, it's relatively still, there's some equanimity there. It's certainly not unpleasant, but it's not really the third jhana. So, again, partly depends on background practice, partly depends on one's psychological patterns. That for some people there's a kind of resistance to a sort of intense happiness for whatever reasons, or however that came to be as a sort of karmic formation, or sankhara. And so sometimes that needs a little unpacking, or the relationship with happiness and sort of bubbly happiness needs a little looking at. But eventually we want to tick them all off in terms of mastery. We could say that each jhana kind of delivers its particular insight. We could say something like that, but more accurately, say each jhana delivers something particular in relation to the ability to let go. And that's anyway what I would translate insight as. Insight has to be directly related with letting go. Insight is what allows letting go. So the first jhana, partly, people are different, whatever, but it might just be the fact that, like, wow, a whole other realm is possible. I think I said this already. Other states of consciousness, other, dimensions are possible when the mind is not entangled. And just that knowledge, that first-hand intimate experience, and the intensity with which it impresses on consciousness as something completely different than we have experienced before, that makes a big difference for a lot of people. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people it will. with the second jhana, it's related to this happiness and this. I think there is this, like I said, in the Buddha's very short description. There's just two words there: ajjatam pasadanam, and it translates as something like internal confidence or internal assurance. But I think I was talking with you about this last night. It's like, it's actually, to me, that the confidence could mean three things, one of three things, or two or three of three things. It could mean right then in that moment, because of the stability of the citta, it's born out of samadhi, and because of the stilling of thought and the sense of how integrated it is, it could be a confidence in the stability of the citta then. And that, instead of having to, like with the first jhana, the soap mixer is doing it quite active, and the vitakka and the vichara, I'm thinking more and more, it's just kind of more still. And there's a kind of confidence from that in the stability. Like, I'm confident that this is stable. Maybe. It could be a confidence that has more to do with the discovery, like I said, of such a profound and fulfilling happiness that doesn't seem, let's say, certainly not primarily dependent on external conditions. And just knowing that, tasting that, drinking from it, that's going to give one quite a bit of confidence in one's life. Do you get that? Yeah. Or it could be, I don't actually know what it's referring to. It's just sort of there, hanging in a mid-sentence. It could be a confidence in the Dharma, and a confidence in one's self, in one's own ability to tread the path that the Buddha described. It's like one really has a sense. It's like, wow, here I am, 2,500 years later, experiencing these remarkable experiences that the Buddha described, and he's got them in a kind of spectrum, and then he describes this other stuff, and if I'm experiencing this, and it has such an intimate sense of this really is what we're talking about, then one's confidence in the Dharma itself and in one's ability to tread the path gets quite a support there. So maybe I can do more. If I can do this, I can do more, and all the way to liberation. So I don't know which of those confidences it is, but confidence is part of the gift, and certainly the confidence of that resort. That's the one I would plumb to as the primary one, plumb for as the primary one. But I think maybe they're all there, and certainly, actually, if I remember back, the confidence it gave me in the path, and that I was actually walking this path, and that it was possible, and what the Buddha was talking about was really. It makes such an impact, much more impact than, just being mindful and being a little calmer or whatever it is, or seeing impermanence and saying, oh, the Buddha talked about, it makes such an impact because of the beauty and the depth and the remarkability of the experience. It really gave me a lot of confidence in the path, and that I was on the path, and that I could do that because, look, I'm doing it. I feel it. But I think probably, for me, the most important one is the discovery of this kind of happiness, that we have access to this kind of happiness. It's open to us, and it's not dependent on external conditions. So I mentioned earlier that probably when we were talking about the first jhana, that each jhana has a primary nimitta in our language and a secondary nimitta, right? And I think I just gave one, I'm not sure how many examples I gave of a secondary nimitta. In the first jhana, the primary nimitta is piti. In the second jhana, the primary nimitta is sukha. But in the first jhana, for example, or any jhana, you could have a secondary nimitta of, say, a bright white light in the mind, or a cloud of light, that sort of thing. You could also, for some people, it's aural. They hear a sound, or sounds, or whatever it is. There can be different ones. Those two are probably the most common. But there's also a kind of other kinds of secondary nimitta which are a little bit more, let's say, intrinsically important or valuable. And one of them is quite common at this stage, the second jhana, and then, in a way, even more or differently so, let's say in the third jhana, is that metta is there. So that sometimes people are not doing a metta practice, I'm just working on the breath and now it's open to the second jhana, actually feel, sometimes people have come to me and say, I think the metta is the primary thing, not the happiness. It's not technically, it's the second, or rather it's a secondary nimitta, but it's very valuable. So automatically in a jhana there is metta in it. It's kind of impossible to be in a jhana and have ill will or aversion and the opposite of metta. So it's more again back to like, what will I become sensitive to? What can I pick up on? What's in the mix of frequencies here? And metta especially noticeable in different flavors in the second and third jhanas. So we can allow that. And sometimes you can focus more on that. You can lean your emphasis more into the metta there. To a little, again, it's a dialer, like how much? Does it become completely primary? Does it become kind of 50-50? Does it become just in the background? And there can be, for a lot of people, obviously a lot of healing with the love that's there. And particularly when we talk about the third jhana, but a lot of healing. But we need to be clear what's the primary nimitta, and that's the sukha, that's the happiness. So that not leaning too much and too often and too long into the love over the stretch of our practice. Why would metta come up at that point? Why would metta reveal itself, do you think? What's that? Yeah, so while saying, because they're both unfabricated, so if I say that slightly differently, if that's okay, when we're in a jhana, we're not fabricating, so I'm introducing more this conversation about fabrication, this teaching about fabrication. When we're in a jhana, and more so as we go down the jhanas, we're fabricating, less and less self, and less of any kind of otherness, other person or whatever. So that the duality between self and other gets less. And there's more sense of non-separation, more oneness. There's less like, that's your space and this is my space, thank you very much, or whatever it is. Or less judging or less irritation. There's just a tendency, self and other, both less fabricated, more non-separateness, less duality there, and less polarity and all that, and all the difficulties. So in a way, there's a kind of natural arising of metta because of that, because we feel less separate. Afterwards, even the metta gets unfabricated, but we'll talk about that later. And that's when we get into equanimity and things. We'll talk about that later. So, if you're practicing in this territory, so when you're practicing and when this territory opens up for you, and it feels like, okay, now that's my playground and that's what I'm really exploring, and you're really into it, and you've, let's say, just spent a standing period in the second jhana or whatever it is, and it's time to end because you have to go to wash up or whatever. So you know it's coming up time to end, but it's still going well and there's still energy there. Then you can spend a few minutes, if you want, just a few minutes at the end of the session, playing what I call 2 games, ping pong and leapfrog. Okay. So, for example, here I am in the second jhana, and then I go, okay, well, let's go to just a normal consciousness. I'm leapfrogging the first jhana, yeah? And then I go, I'll go from there to 1. And then I'll go from 1 back to 2. And then I'll go from 2 back to 1. And then I'll go to 2 again. Then I'm ping-ponging. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. I actually need to practice that transition both ways. So this is a minor part of our practice, but one of the elements of mastery. Can I really just move back and forth at ease between a jhana and its adjacent, any jhana and its adjacent jhana? So if I'm practicing 2, can I go to 1? And I haven't got to 3 yet, then 2 to 1 to 2 to 1 to 2. It's all very light. It's all just a game. Yeah. And then I can also practice leapfrog. Now here there's not too many leapfrog options because we've only got 0, 1 and 2. So you can go 2 to 0 to 2. There's not much leapfrog options. But so you can just spend a few minutes of fun at the end of sitting playing ping pong and leapfrog. And these are the elements of mastery, and they're really, again, I would like to encourage this. It's not, I wouldn't spend a whole sitting doing this, but they're part of learning the territory, they're part of the discrimination, they're part of the mastery, they're part of what makes the mind and the chitta really malleable and all that. So again, when we come to talking about mastery, etc., we have to think about pacing. When is it, is it not ripe yet to try this stuff? I'm just getting used to the second jhana, and it's like, it's too soon to try going for a walk in the second jhana when I'm just getting used to it. I really need to be really, really familiar. And when I do try all that stuff, like the whole practice and the whole tenor of the days here, we really want to encourage this kind of light playfulness. If I get too heavy and too tight and too pressured, it just squeezes, basically it squeezes the sukha out of things, and then there won't be that, there won't be the fruit. Yeah. So the whole thing is very light when it's time to play. Okay, so I don't know where things are at in the Dharma world these days. I don't get out much. It's actually true. But certainly, if I think back years ago, I don't know, maybe this is a question for you. Who's heard from anyone, oh, careful with the jhanas, there's a danger you might get attached. Okay, so some years ago this would have been everyone, it would have been the default, like you don't really want to be, A, what's the point? It's not insight. And B, there's really a danger there that you're going to get attached. And that's really pretty serious. So, like I said, it's interesting. I'm not sure. Maybe 2/5 of the people. I don't know. Anyway, half of you put your hand up. So, if you go back to what the Buddha said, what did he say about all this? There is one occasion where I remember, and I'm sure that maybe I was one occasion where I remember him talking about a monk who then was very ill, and because of the low energy was not able to access whatever level of jhana he was able before his illness or when he was well. And this monk was, having some dukkha about that. And the Buddha said, it's anatta. You see it as anatta, both the jhana and the self. So it's not self. So there's that kind of attachment. But what the Buddha mostly said a few times is this, talking about the pleasure of jhana, and he said, the pleasure of jhana, is a pleasure I will allow myself. This is someone who's, talks about the middle way in terms of renunciation and senses, but basically relative to most of us, he's pretty extreme renunciate. This extreme renunciate, this is a pleasure I will allow myself. This is a pleasure that should not be feared. This is a pleasure that should be pursued and developed. This is a pleasure that should not be feared. This is a pleasure that should be pursued and developed. And when he talks about sense pleasures, he talks about them as a pit of vipers, a pit of, upward, those elephant traps, old hunter-gatherers, they've got these like big wooden stakes, and the mammoth is supposed to fall in, and, that's the sort of image he gives for sense pleasures. It looks like a nice piece of grass or whatever it is there, and actually it's so he talks about the jhanas in that way, this not to be feared, this is a pleasure I will allow myself, this pleasure should be pursued and developed. And he talks about sense pleasures, there's a whole list of like pretty extreme negative similes for sense pleasures. Is it, or was it, the case that somewhere along the line that modern Dharma teachings have kind of reversed that? Reversed the Buddha's teachings in relation to these kinds of pleasures, sense pleasure and jhanic pleasure, and reversed the Buddha's concerns. regarding sense pleasure, jhanic pleasure, and attachment to either. I find that really interesting. Historically and psychologically, and how that may have evolved and why that may have evolved, and it may be changing. It's definitely changing, no question. It's changing. But the Buddha's pretty clear about this. Again, I don't know if anyone is still unsure when the piti, for example, feels very sexual or it feels like orgasmic, but again, just to remind you, and is that okay, and surely, it's a bit much or it can't be right, just to remind you again of the Buddha's words that we've heard before, describing the jhana, piti, sukha, whole body pervaded, no spot, leaving no spot untouched. So what he does not say is the whole body pervaded except below the waist and kind of above the middle of the thigh. He says whole body. So I think, again, this is one of these things. It's very easy. It's changing now, but back, X number of years, it was really quite a pervasive thing about this. Ooh, you really shouldn't mess with the jhanas. There's a real danger that you'll get attached. And again, can we bring a little intelligence to this, a little questioning? It seems to me that there's three kinds of attachment that are potential in jhanas. With jhanas. So one is attachment to the pleasure. That would be the most obvious one that people would think of, that you're going to get attached to the pleasure. So after, I don't know how many years I've been teaching, 16, 17 years, something like that. I honestly struggle to remember one person who had actually experienced an actual jhana, let's say more than 10 times, who was attached to the pleasure there. Maybe other people are encountering that sort of thing a lot, but I'm not. I don't think it's a problem for Westerners. I just wonder, what would that attachment look like? This someone who's attached to there's like a basement at Gaia House where it's a bit like an opium den, and these old yogis are there just like in the dark and getting old and not doing their work. And what do we actually think it would look like? Maybe it's like, what I think it would look like is then this person who's attached to the jhana, they're unwilling to explore or investigate the difficult. I think it's extremely rare. I've never encountered it. I really sit here struggling to think, okay, is there anyone I can think of? I just can't. After about 10 times of a jhana, you're not going to be attached to the pleasure in any way that's or let's say you're not going to be attached to the pleasure in any kind of problematic way. I just can't see that. What I do see, and what we might recognize in ourselves much more commonly, is an attachment to looking at, obsessing with, prioritizing, attending to the difficult. And we mentioned this before, and sometimes that's just a psychological tendency, sometimes it's a cultural tendency, sometimes it's a dharmically trained tendency. So when I have the option of giving equal attention an equal number of times to the pleasant, I find that I can't. I'm so trained. Immediately there's a contraction in the body, immediately there's some dukkha, the mind goes there. And that's great, that willingness is great, but if it's not balanced with an equal freedom and willingness the other side, there's actually effectively an attachment. And sometimes that attachment is ideological, because a person thinks, well, this is where the real stuff is. And what's happening in a jhana is you're actually suppressing that or hiding it. But that's what's dukkha is what's real. A jhana is a fabrication. A jhana is a kind of construction or irreality, or you're stepping out of touch, hiding from the real stuff. This is, again, we talk about how common attachments are and how entrenched attachments are. That can be extremely common and extremely entrenched. So sometimes as a teacher over the years, I have to be really, really delicate and careful how I bring that sort of point up, and what I say to people, and how I might say it. Or, so it could be an ideological attachment, it could just be a habitual. It's just habitual, again, just tendency of personality, tendency of culture, upbringing, or tendency of Dharma practice. And in a way then, practicing the jhanas and doing that wholeheartedly and being open-minded will actually remedy that opposite attachment, which doesn't even occur to people that it might be an attachment. Because I'm practicing that. Let's not buy into that view. Let's not get sucked into the difficult. Let's go here. But I want to keep them both open, and both, I'm really able to do both, I'm really free to do both. That's where we want to get to, range, possibility. Second, what seems to me a second way of getting attached to the jhanas is to get all like, look at me, what I can do. I can reach this or that jhana. And there's a kind of grandiosity of self-view. Again, I would say, let's say after 20 times of a certain jhana, it should be really obvious to a person that it's not self making it happen. It arises, this jhana, when the conditions are there. When the conditions are there, a jhanic experience, a jhanic perception arises. It depends on the conditions, all kinds of conditions, all kinds. I mentioned that monk. The Buddha also says at a certain point depends on the digestion being not too hot, not too cold. So in Asian medicine they have this idea of digestion being too hot, too cold. I certainly know, samadhi is a lot dependent on things like digestion, all kinds of things. Energy levels, all kinds of factors. One really sees, if one is, it's almost difficult not to recognize, let's say after 20 experiences, that it's dependent on conditions. It's not something the self can get grandiose and sort of pumped up about. Again, what's actually much more common is a negative self-view in relation to not reaching a jhana, or I'm not far enough along yet. I can't, I'm a failure, I bet everyone else is better, I'm going too slowly. And then what can happen is a person thinks, I want to attain this deeper jhana, I want to attain the jhanas or whatever it is, this jhana, that jhana, beyond where I am. But actually the intention is one of achievement for decorating the self-view and propping up the self-view, or addressing a kind of more negative, that's a better way of saying, of wanting to address a negative self-view. If I could just get that, then I'd feel better about myself. Get a badge, whatever. And sometimes that intention is not fully conscious. We actually don't quite realize what's in the mix of our intention when it comes to this. We don't realize what's actually operating is a kind of avoidance of a negative self, an intention to avoid a negative self-view, and that can be quite subtle and operating subtly. So even there, the attachment is the opposite of what we tend to think. And this kind of, we tend to think, attached to the self-view and the grandiosity, it looks like this. Actually, no, it's happening in a reverse way, and sometimes much more subtly. It's like, why? Let the jhana give you the deepest things it can give you. And the deepest things are the beauty of that happiness, and the way it touches the being, and the way it bathes the whole body and the whole chitta. That's a much deeper, more far-reaching, more long-lasting, more impacting gift than it gives me, I have achieved. And I can say to myself, I have achieved X or Y, or tell other people, or I have achieved X or Y. Or when there's a conversation, several people have achieved X or Y, I can also say, yes, I have too. Or feel to myself that I have to. Let the jhanas give you the deepest gifts that they want to give you, that they can give you. And that also goes back to what's significant, what are we emphasizing? When we're talking about the happiness. The most perhaps for me, the most interesting kind of question of attachment that might arise from jhana is attachment to view. Okay? So for example, someone opening, let's say, opening up to the sixth jhana, and this sort of infinite consciousness, and the experience there, and it gets really brief when the Buddha talks about that, but the experience of an infinite consciousness, and it's there and it pervades the cosmos, or it's a realm, almost like a transcendent realm, it's more accurate, but it can be felt both ways, we'll talk about it. It's possible then that someone opening to that experience says, this is ultimately true, or this is what they're talking about, this is the cosmic consciousness, this is whatever, and decides that it's ultimately true and gets attached to that as a view. To be attached to a view means to really believe this view is true, this perception is true. Or the fifth jhana, or the seventh jhana, or whatever. Again here, there's something opposite, because I would say attachment to that kind of view, let's say this cosmic consciousness, this infinite awareness, this vast awareness being the ultimate reality, the eternal backdrop of all things, the source of all things, etc., the nature of everything, it is emptiness, it is, etc., etc. That kind of view, it's much more likely to get in, someone's much more likely to get stuck in that view and believe it's the end and the ultimate truth when one hasn't done jhanas 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's the opposite. It's exactly having the map of, for example, something that goes beyond this quasi-sixth jhana state of infinite consciousness. Because once you get to the seventh jhana or the eighth jhana, you see, that's a fabricated state. It's only a stage. So it's actually the jhanas that help us wean off a view to this or that as the ultimate truth. It's, again, the concern, the jhanas are rather a remedy for certain attachments rather than a concern, I would say. That kind of view of a vast awareness being ultimately real, cosmic consciousness, awareness being the nature of things, that awareness being eternal and etc., unruffled, that being the nature of awareness, all that, that's much more likely to arise from sort of standard insight meditation practice with a lot of practice. It's a very common experience. It's also very common in other spiritual traditions. It's actually really, really common. But if we can go beyond that kind of experience, and we have the map, and it places it, we begin, hopefully, to experience something beyond it. It can't be ultimate. I've gone beyond it. And we begin to understand its context. So what is that exactly? How did that experience, this vast, eternal seeming awareness, cosmic consciousness, whatever it is, how did it arise? How did it dependently arise as a perception? And we understand its context. So this understanding it dependently arising, dependently ceasing, it's more than saying we see that it's impermanent as a view, because a person can go in and out of the vastness of awareness or the cosmic consciousness or whatever many times and think, my experience of it is impermanent, but it's not impermanent. That's really common. It's eternal. It's just there and unchanging and radiant forever and serene and untouched forever, and it embraces everything and it permeates everything. There's different variations. So if I realize my experience of it is impermanent, I can either accept that my experience of it is impermanent and will go in and out, or I can just work towards making it more and more of the time I'm hanging out there. But that's not what I mean by understanding its dependent arising and dependent cessation. What I mean by understanding its dependent arising and dependent cessation is, how does this perception arise? And how does it cease? Not that it arises and ceases, but how. It's dependent on a certain amount of unfabricating. And if I unfabricate more, it goes beyond it. It's a different thing than just, it's impermanent. Or my experience of it is impermanent. So hopefully if we have the right context for what we're doing in the whole of the Dharma, what we're doing in the whole of jhana practice fits into that. This kind of attachment doesn't arise, or we can get beyond it, put it that way. So the more common danger here is attachment to what the Buddha would call wrong view, or a misunderstanding or a limited and limiting view of emptiness, of the nature of awareness. So if I think that's the ultimate nature of awareness, it's not ultimate. It's a perception, it's a relative perception. It's incredibly useful, incredibly healing and valuable and liberating to a certain extent. Is it ultimate? No. How am I going to find out that it's not ultimate? Limited or misunderstanding, a wrong view about what nibbana is and all this stuff. So the shoe is rather on the other foot, I think, in terms of attachment and jhana. They're actually very powerful in terms of weaning us off what can be really difficult kinds of attachment to sense pleasures, and in this case to certain spiritual views. And this one, that kind of thing that I've just described, I mean, I said I couldn't really think of anyone who'd got attached to pleasure, anyone that I'd encountered as a teacher or I'd heard talk to over however many years of teaching, meeting a lot of people. Couldn't think of anyone. But I think in the first 6 months of teaching, how many people I encountered who it seemed to me were actually pretty entrenched in that, some version of that vast awareness and that's ultimate, etc. I lost count easily in the first 6 months. It's so common. And it can get very, very entrenched. So there's people who are there in that kind of view for really decades, and they'll never get out of it. Sometimes the language that goes with it is very free and easy. It's very like, well, there's awareness is ultimately there. I don't have to do anything. It's just there. Whatever happens, whether I'm aware or not, it's there. And everything's kind of equal within that. And so it can sound very easy, and the person seems unattached, and it's all very free. And maybe even goes with the view, there's no need to meditate because this is just there all the time. And actually all that is hiding a really quite entrenched view that's very, very difficult to budge. But one of the ways of going beyond it is actually with the jhanas and with the jhana map, and actually just putting things in their context, and, as I said, understanding their dependent arising and dependent fading, and understanding the whole process, and then having this context and a whole different relation with all these beautiful and actually really valuable mystical openings, and their relationship with truth, and therefore with liberation. So I think that's all I wanted to say today. Someone left me. Nicole, was this a note for now or just? No? Okay, so I'll look at it later. Yeah, okay. So, should we take a couple of questions, or should we just leave it enough for now? Let's just sit quietly. I think that's enough. Yeah. you, everybody, and time for tea.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org/donate.